Welcome to the Kick Sugar Coach podcast. Join me each week as I interview experts who will share the science of sugar, sugar addiction, and different approaches to recovery. We hope to empower you with the information and inspiration, insights, and strategies you need to break up with sugar and fall in love with healthy whole foods so you can prevent and reverse chronic disease, lose weight, boost your mood and energy. Feel free to go to my website for details on my coaching programs and to access free resources, kicksugarcoach.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Kick Sugar Summit. I have with me today Dr. Emily August, and her bio is basically this. She's a professor, associate professor actually, at Stockton University, where she teaches 19th century British literature and culture, medical humanities, literatures of crime and detection, creative writing. Her poetry, and she has her own books of poetry, and she's got a book of poetry coming out, and it investigates topics of intergenerational trauma and intimate partner violence. And her poems have been previously published in literary journals. And Emily, do you have a book out yet, or is your first book about to come out?
It's my first book. I'm so excited.
Amazing, amazing. And of course, on top of all of this, scholarly genius and poetic genius, she has her own story of recovery, and she's discovered as she's been walking this path, as she likes to say, she's trying to create a space in the recovery movement and conversation for people who are not served by food addiction recovery programs and people who are not being served by eating disorder recovery approaches as well. So she's got this kind of unique insight into other ways of getting the job done, of finding recovery. So welcome, Dr. August.
Thank you.
So let's start with your story. I don't actually even know it. So tell me a bit about your own journey of recovery from, I'm assuming, sugar addiction, food addiction. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I come from a background of just long time, what I now identify as food addiction and understand as food addiction. Ever since childhood, I experienced binge eating disorder. I experienced addictive sort of and increasingly addictive behavior around food. I was one of those people who just from early childhood always never understood why I couldn't eat like other people, why I couldn't relate to food like other people. And just over the decades of my life, as with any kind of chronic progressive condition, my food addiction just got worse and worse and impeded my ability to engage in everyday life more and more. So by my early 30s, I was really suffering a lot of health problems, but also just a lot of psychological problems related to what I describe as just being chained to food. And other addictive substances. I was a smoker. I was a pack-a-day smoker for 18 years. And I now I can identify that I was a practicing alcoholic that whole time as well. And so my life really had gotten pretty bleak, where I would just sort of go to work, come home, and engage in my addictions. And that was my cycle every single day for many, many years, chronically and progressively. And that's kind of the very, very short version of how I was living my life before food addiction recovery. I had always, or from a very young age, I had identified as a binge eater, that I had binge eating disorder. I'd heard of that. That was sort of in the ether in the 90s, like that terminology. And when I had originally read the symptoms of binge eating disorder as kind of a teenager, I was like, oh, right. I recognize that, all of the sort of classic symptoms. And then I would at various times in my life try to moderate, I guess, try to address my relationship to food. And sometimes that would last for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And sometimes that was not possible at all. And I had reached a point in my 20s, I think, probably by my early 20s or at least my mid 20s, where I just let that go. I think a lot of us who sort of experience food addiction without really knowing exactly what that is, I think a lot of us reach that point. I I was on a kind of parallel journey of self-discovery, like we all are throughout my teenage and young 20s, and just coming increasingly into my own self-confidence and my own kind of direction for my life. And part of that is just allowing yourself to kind of be who you are, and just sort of setting aside the drama and the I'm not quite sure of the word, but the difficulty of trying to do something that is not working. And so I was like, look, this is for whatever reason, I don't know why, but when I start eating, I can't stop. I eat until I'm in pain, in debilitating pain. I do this every day. I don't know why, and I can't seem to stop doing it. And I'm just going to let that go. This is who I am. This is how I was made. There's nothing I can do about that. And so I came to some peace about it. But it was still difficult to live a life of addiction, you know? And so once I discovered, I finally, I think it was in my 30s, I decided to try to give it one last go. I went to a therapist who specialized in part in eating disorder recovery and just kind of eating disorders. And I was like, okay, let me give this one last shot. And she was the one who introduced me to the addiction model and to abstinence-based recovery. And as I investigated that more through like YouTube videos and information online, it was so obvious. It was like that moment of revelation when the heavens open and everything clicks. And I was like, right, that's why I can't stop eating. I'm addicted. Obviously, it was so obvious. It's just that no one had ever communicated it in that language to me before. And I had some experience with abstinence-based concepts previously in my life. As a teenager, I was sent to AA for a little bit when it became obvious really quite early that that I had substance abuse just kind of as a part of my life. And so as a teenager, I had gone to AA, I'd read the big book. I kind of had some of those concepts percolating in the back of my mind for many decades, even though I didn't continue on with AA after I went, I think, for about a year or something like that. And then, of course, I quit smoking a year before I started food addiction recovery. And so, quitting smoking is, you really come to terms with what it feels like to be addicted to something and to eliminate that, and just how real addiction is, and what the physiological, the psychological, the emotional fallout of addiction is. Yeah. Is that
great? You're doing great.
Am I meandering everywhere?
No, you're not. You're riveting. Just keep going.
You're sweet.
Yeah, just keep telling your story. This is incredible. I keep looking at you thinking, she's a professor, and she started she was in AA in her teens. Like, it's amazing that your brain has survived, and you can be here to tell us the story of what it's like to really know 3 times you've had to unhook from addiction. So this is really incredible. Keep going.
Oh, you're very sweet. Thank you. I think about that a lot. It is such a miracle to me that I made it through addiction and recovery. Yes. So let's see. Oh, yeah. So I was introduced to food addiction recovery through Bright Line Eating, a program that, many people are becoming increasingly familiar with. And that's kind of how I was able to link because Bright Line Eating, it's doing a couple of different things, but one of the things that it's doing is sort of modeling itself on an abstinence-based, a kind of classic 12 steps abstinence-based model of addiction recovery. So I was familiar with that. I was comfortable with that. It was a good entry point for me. And the neuroscience around addiction is very compelling and very irrefutable, and just very much what my life experience is. We're in a cultural moment in which, and this kind of speaks to maybe what we'll talk about a bit later, but we're in a cultural moment in which there's a lot of gaslighting around addiction and around abstinence. And there's a lot of shaming around abstinence-based addiction recovery. And it's a difficult time to be an abstinence-based addiction recovery. It's not a popular time to to be an addict and to believe in addiction in our culture. And so it can be difficult to stand strongly and confidently in one's experience as an addict, and to be able to embrace that experience and that identity as being, honestly, I mean, sure, valid and real, but just neutral. It doesn't have to be that big of a deal. Most of us have some kind of health condition. Many of us have chronic health conditions. Addiction is just another chronic health condition. And it's a chronic health condition that I believe and that most of us experience as requiring abstinence as a management protocol. And again, that's just value neutral. It doesn't have to be good or bad. It doesn't have to be right or wrong. And it doesn't have to be everybody's answer. But we live in a moment in which that's not very popular.
Emily, what do you mean by gaslighting? And why do you think it's not popular right now?
Yeah. So what I noticed when I entered food addiction recovery through Bright Line Eating. And what I noticed was, and I've been familiar with the idea of moderation since childhood. I mean, moderation in eating disorder recovery and moderation as an approach to eating is nothing new. I remember reading about those kinds of ideas. I remember seeing books from the 70s and 80s that advocated what we now call a moderation approach. So I've always been kind of familiar with that. And I always knew I was a person who could not moderate. I have never been able to moderate anything. I'm a classic addict. I have the neurology and the brain chemistry and the physiology of an addict. And that is what it is. My lived experience is that I cannot moderate any addictive substance, and I never have been able to. When I entered Bright Line Eating with an abstinence-based model, I became so much more acutely aware of how unpopular abstinence is in our current cultural moment. Abstinence is very much aligned with restriction. When it's applied to food, it's very much aligned with dieting. It's very much aligned with, shaming and withholding and punitive sort of ideologies around one's relationship to one's body. And I see exactly where that comes from. And I don't necessarily fault anyone for having strong resistance to the idea of abstinence. We have a long history in Western culture of horrible body shaming, fat phobia, dietary management, body management, all kinds of just a toxic cloud that really surrounds the way we approach food in the body in our culture. And things like restriction, negative diet culture messaging, those things are pervasive and harmful, and they have harmed all of us. And so I understand why people associate abstinence with basically diet culture when we're talking about food addiction recovery. It's just that I don't. That's not how I see abstinence. And I don't necessarily even see moderation as like an opposite of that. I was really privileged to grow up in basically a body neutral, fat positive, fat activist household. So I never had that experience as a young person, as a teenager, of growing up in a household in the environment that nurtures you, in the environment that's supposed to protect you, and growing up with really negative, shaming messages around my body. I never had that. My mom was always very explicit about, the body is a value neutral biological object. It's a collection of systems and cells and organs that function across a spectrum. There's nothing good about the body. There's nothing bad about the body in any shape, form, presentation. It just is what it is, and it functions how it functions. And we do what we can to maximize the function of the meat sack in which we have found ourselves. And so I'm almost kind of uniquely positioned to come into our current cultural moment in which moderation is, it's kind of presented as the only viable, healthy, and politically sound, because it's not just about physiology, biology, and psychology, but food and bodies are political. And in our current moment, moderation is like the political good. And abstinence is the political evil. And I see how people got there. And I don't disagree with how people got there. I just don't think that is the only option. And so what I mean by gaslighting is what I'm seeing in current eating disorder treatment, right? Current clinical protocols around eating disorder recovery are all of the institutional resources are put into moderation. Anyone who comes into traditional mainstream clinical eating disorder treatment that I've heard from is really pushed toward moderation. Anybody who cannot moderate is sort of defined as somehow aberrant or wrong, and that the goal is to get somebody to moderate. And if you're not able to do that, there's something wrong with you, because there's something wrong with abstinence. Abstinence is restrictive. Abstinence is shaming and negative and wrong, and it doesn't work. And so to me, that's, a friend of mine in the Bright Line Eating community, Dr. Joy Jacobs, talks a lot about how that creates an environment of gaslighting for addicts, for people in addiction recovery, for whom abstinence is simply a necessary
choice.
Management protocol.
And, can I add the word impossible? That I think that there's people who think that it's unnecessary, it's psychologically unhealthy, all those things that you listed. But I think there's also this undercurrent of it's impossible. So why set women up to try and achieve this perfect abstinence when it's impossible and they're going to fail? You're setting women up for this constant feeling of like, I'm on day one again.
Absolutely. I'm just taking a note here.
Yeah.
That's such a great point. And so again, that's such another great example of why it has been politically necessary to move away from diet culture, from restriction, from all of these super negative, from perfection oriented, toxic bodily negativity in that way. Absolutely. And I am part of that cultural movement as well. I very much consider myself a fat liberationist, a body activist. My abstinence-based eating disorder recovery doesn't engage with weight or size or body image at all. It's unrelated. It's totally unrelated. Like what I look like and how much mass my molecules take up on the planet. I have way more interesting things to think about than that. But yes, these unattainable bodies that have been used to discipline us and punish us and shape us and correct us into these unhealthy, obedient, subjects. Absolutely, we have to move away from that. And we also have to move away from the idea that abstinence-based recovery is the same as that. It's not. It just isn't. And that's okay too. And yes, abstinence is hard. I think managing a chronic health condition is hard. And And there are times anybody with any chronic health condition, asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, whatever it is, are going to have periods of time where it feels impossible to manage that health condition, or where the protocols feel unimplementable. And also we'll have times when they are just day-to-day managing that condition in the background. I think what makes abstinence truly difficult is the environment of gaslighting, is the environment of shaming towards people for whom abstinence is necessary. But it is not impossible. And there's millions of us living that life. It is possible to walk away from sugar and flour and live like a full, rich, beautiful, nuanced, politically radical life.
Yeah, awesome. Great. Okay. Where would you like to go from here?
Yeah, good question. I feel like I'm meandering a little bit. So if I circle back or anything, forgive me. I can talk a little bit about, so one of the things that's been, that has sort of helped me stay abstinent and helped me on my journey of abstinence is community, right? Finding a community. And that's kind of why I want to make an intervention in this arena. Why, my experience in traditional food addiction recovery is that it actually is very weight focused. It is very body focused. It is very size focused. I think one of the terms in like traditional, like Overeaters Anonymous and other kind of 12-step abstinence-based recovery, I don't remember the term exactly, but it's something like physical recovery is one of the goals of those programs, which means weight loss. And that's like I'm very allergic to that ideology. I'm very allergic to that terminology. It's, and I haven't found an abstinence-based food addiction community that is not imbricated with diet culture. And so that is painful for me. It's painful. I can totally see why people aren't drawn toward, and even people who feel like they might be food addicts and people who feel like they might benefit from abstinence. I can see why people don't want to join up with these communities. The diet culture is pervasive and it's really harmful, and it's just not, it just doesn't serve me. And there's so many of us that it doesn't serve. And I have, over the past 5 years, I entered food addiction recovery just over 5 years ago. I have built up an approach to food addiction recovery that leaves diet culture in the dust, that doesn't engage with diet culture at all, but that still follows a general protocol of abstinence gleaned from many traditions. So there's a whole community of people in abstinence-based food addiction recovery that aren't being served because of the diet culture ideologies. And then there's a whole community of people in moderation-based eating disorder recovery who aren't being served because their bodies don't moderate. Their bodies, the bodies that they came into this world with, their brain chemistry, their physiology are not set up for moderation. And I'm one of those people, and there's lots of us out there. And again, value neutral. There's nothing right or wrong with that. It just, it doesn't have to be a whole drama. It just is what it is. And there needs to be a massive movement and cultural conversation and coming together of people who require abstinence and who are not interested in diet culture. And so that is the community that I've tried really painstakingly to cultivate over the past 5 years. There are a lot of barriers to bringing together a community of this kind, because there's like, it's like the it's like the Capulets and the Montagues or something. I don't even know if that's the right reference, but it's like these warring houses. There's like there's no way that people in these two communities are coming together. It's like a lot of fighting and a lot of disagreement. And I see that we have more in common than not. And I see that we could all benefit. Any of us who need eating disorder recovery can benefit from having these two communities come together in conversation in places that we intersect. I learn a lot from people in the moderation community, especially because most of those people have political goals aligned with mine. My political goals around the body are our fat liberation, our body liberation. Any body of any shape, size, presentation gets to be a human, gets to take up the space it takes, gets to have civil rights, gets to have love and desire and pleasure and success. And so my political goals are really aligned with people who tend toward the moderation approach. But my health management goals are aligned with abstinence. And so if that describes you as well, seek me out. I am slowly, painstakingly building up a community of us and hopefully eventually a movement of us who are embracing abstinence, which is a way of approaching life that has existed for centuries, many centuries. There's nothing new about abstinence. There's nothing particularly radical or not about abstinence. It crosses cultures. It's possible, it's achievable, it's fine. It's just a way of doing life. And you can still do that way of life and support holistic, nurturing body politics.
Interesting. And you know what? And there's a whole other camp. And I love this whole conversation around having these two seemingly on the continuum, they're on the far ends of the continuum, come together and have some rich conversations about the intersection, as you said, because there is a lot to learn from the moderation camp. Because let's say they're on the addiction spectrum and they're desperately trying to moderate, they are going to be forced or encouraged and supported to do the inner work because they're not doing abstinence. And some of the recovery and the tools and the insights and the nurturing that happens because they're looking at, okay, I don't want to say no, never again, never forever. I want to figure out how to moderate. So what can I do in this moment to ask myself, I know I don't really need to go to the kitchen and look for something to eat. What do I really need? And all that beautiful healing recovery work is wonderful. And for many, many of us, no matter how much we do that, it is never going to bring the peace that walking the path of abstinence will bring. But it doesn't mean it's wrong and not valuable. And so there's this cross potential, and that there's people over here doing this incredibly intense inner healing recovery work. And on all levels, body, mind, spirit, the holistic recovery that you're talking about, nurturing. And, that we can pull from there and vice versa. And some of these people that are doing this work will go, oh my gosh, I just make a decisive decision to break up with sugar and flour and something shifts. I stop craving. I stop food obsessing. I stop fussing. It just, a peace comes over me. And what a wonderful way for people to move back and forth with the insights and the different approaches. Yeah, because I agree that as a team, we'll catch more people. The other thing that's happening is I'm starting to see this now, and I just have a client now myself who's just finding the middle road where 6 days of the week, she does the delay, don't deny approach. 6 days of the week, she eats her abstinent meals, 3 meals, no snacks. And on Sunday, she says to herself, you can have whatever you want. One. Now, some people, it's a whole day. For her, it's just one treat. You let me know. What is it? I'm never going to say never again to you. But here's the deal. When we go to the DQ and get whatever the heck the ice cream you think that you want, when it's over, it's over. And if you fuss and cry and moan and arch your back and pitch a fit because you want more, the answer is going to be no. And if this is too hard on me and too difficult to manage, it will be never forever. And she is going into months of extraordinary recovery. She has actually come to the Sundays and has said to her body, Sunday, what would you like? And the body's like, I'm good. She hasn't even gone to, right? So that freaks out both camps because they don't know what to do with someone like that. Right. And there's all these nuanced approaches in between the two extremes of moderation is the goal. That is a sign that you're recovered because you can moderate. Or the sign of recovery in the other camp is you are abstinent and perfectly in every day in every way. Right. And it just muddies everything when we've got people coming up the middle to find some kind of sweet spot that works for them. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful because I don't think that the opposite of addiction is abstinence. I think the opposite of addiction is options, is choice. You and I choose to be abstinent. I don't want moderation. If I had a fairy godmother that could tap me on the top of my head and say, you can now moderate, I'd be like, no, thanks. No, that's not the wish I want. Right. But what do we do with those people either who are not there yet or that isn't what they want, but they also don't want to do the intuitive eating thing. They've done that path. It was a disaster. It was just months and years of binging. So I don't know what you'd like to say to that.
Yeah, that's the term I've been looking for this whole time, intuitive eating.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so great. My mind is going 1,000 miles an hour. One thing I will say is all of that. Yes, beautiful, beautiful. And that we can learn from each other. And that one of the things, I was raised as a person who, it was a priority that the way I was raised, that I was taught how to learn from anything, like anything you can learn from, take what you can learn from that and just leave the rest, which is, a famous saying in recovery culture. But it's kind of like one of the principles I was raised in is find the thing that you can learn from this. And so not only do we have a lot to learn from each other, and that for some people there may be a middle way, but about inner work, because, people in abstinence-based recovery who stay in lifelong abstinence are doing the hardcore inner work. That's, abstinence requires kind of two parallel tracks. And one of them is abstinence. And one of them is the inner work that allows you to build a new life in the shape of abstinence. And that requires gobs of inner work. A lot of people are really resistant to the 12 steps for many perfectly wonderful and fine reasons. I really see the 12 steps as just another path of inner work. Honestly, I see them as like journaling prompts. They're a set of 12 questions that are going to get you somewhere on your journey of self-actualization. Any spirituality, any religion has similar questions that it asks of life experience. Just pick a path of inner work. It could be the 12 steps. You can leave the God language in there or take it out. It can be, Buddhist koans. It can be, I'm reading this fascinating Christian theology theory of addiction and recovery right now. I think it's called something like The Beautiful Letdown, a theology of addiction or something like that. It's heavily Christian. I don't, if you have a lot of trauma around Christianity, I wouldn't recommend it. I grew up in a non-religious household. And so I don't get as triggered, and I can kind of easily scrape away some of the language and ideas that don't work and replace them with others. But my point is there's so many ways of doing the inner work, whether you're doing abstinence or moderation, or intuitive eating or whatever it is. That's what makes us all whole anyway, right? The most peaceful and nurturing life path is always going to be a path of deep, consistent, sustained inner work. What I also want to say is, I also have come a little bit to my own version of a marriage of the two, or an intermingling of the two, where after several years of abstinence, what I realized very quickly when I eliminated sugar and flour from my diet, paired with the inner work of becoming a person in recovery, what I discovered very quickly is that I could finally, there's like this incredible brain healing that happens. And that's true of, someone in alcohol recovery. That's true of someone in drug recovery. The healing that happens to your brain chemistry when you abstain from the toxic substance that is triggering the neurochemical reaction. It's kind of, and people in recovery talk about this all the time. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. I never knew it was even possible to like feel that, like the way that I feel day to day is, I didn't even know it was part of the human experience. I was like, people walk around feeling like this, just a level of contented, sort of even keeled, contentment, happiness, joy. And one of the things that happened, and I was deliberate about this too, it didn't happen by accident. I really trained my attention on what is happening to my body now that I have abstained. What is happening to my body now that it doesn't consume sugar and flour? What does it feel like to be in my body? What do foods taste like? What kinds of foods? I did intuitive eating within the brackets of abstinence. And that is still what I do, is that I built up over time a knowledge of my body. I learned my body. I learned what kinds of foods that feel fueling and energizing to my body, and what kind of foods sort of drag my body down. I learned what times of day I'm most hungry at. And so that's when I should time my meals. I learned kind of like, people talk about macros, whatever. I just learned kind of roughly the quantities of food, of each kinds of foods that are most fueling to me and most empowering to me. And I do that all within the boundaries of abstinence. I still eat no sugar. I eat no flour. I eat 3 meals a day. And I bound my quantities consistently. But I developed my own kind of food plan intuitively by really training a deep attention to my body and what it was like. What I say often in my community is that the only way that I could hear my body finally was by eliminating sugar and flour. That is how I am able to do intuitive eating at all. That is how I am able to hear the rhythms of my body that were obscured by the noise of addiction, of the addiction response. So it's still possible. It's not like you're denying your body and effacing your body if you practice abstinence. For me, it's removing a white noise machine. It's removing a barrier, and it's removing a film and getting clarity.
Oh my gosh, that's so beautifully articulated. I can see why you're a poet. I'll be a writer too. I am looking forward to your book coming out. There's so much to unpack there for me. One of the things I wanted to add to our conversation is that in my early days of recovery, I first tried the intuitive because I grew up on Janine Roth, right? I grew up on, when you're hungry, eat what you want, intuitively choose the foods. If it's M&Ms, it's M&Ms. Eat when you're stopped, when you're full, right? And it was all like, take all the diet out of it, all the feelings of deprivation or control and restriction and denial. And I love the word that you used, which was punishment. Like I'm being left out, like I'm unloved, like I don't get to have chocolate, right? She took all that out of the equation. I could not find recovery to save my life I just left to my own devices. If I'm an intuitive eater with anything, if I intuitively eat outside of the context of abstinence, I'm going to eat nothing but processed junk food all day long. And for me, unfortunately, I had migraines, suicidal depression, infections, weight issues, cystic acne, rosacea, like cancer, like it was killing me. And so this effort that I was making to try and moderate and be an intuitive eater failed miserably. So then down the road, I eventually discovered, like you, oh my gosh, the concept of abstinence, and the abstinence wasn't just white sugar, that it was also flours, right? That was a huge piece of the equation. Once I understood that, it was very helpful. But even then, in those early days, I still saw recovery. But the end goal of recovery was abstinence, sustained abstinence. And it took me years to figure out, oh my goodness, that is not recovery. Abstinence is a tool of recovery. Weighing and measuring is a tool of recovery. Recovery is when we are able to connect to peace, joy, and love. That's it, right? Like that is peace of mind. And so if you can get to peace, joy, and love and health and self-connection and a connection to a higher power of your own understanding through moderation, that you get recovery, whatever, but recovery isn't moderation. Recovery isn't abstinence. Those are both tools. And you get to decide what tools bring you to the recovery. What are you recovering? Our capacity to be self-connected, to be healthy, to be vital, to be connected to people and a higher power and peace of mind, all those things, right? We're recovering the highest possible human experience. And whatever tools you use that get you there, have at her. But the tool of abstinence, I love that you're drawing attention, how maligned it is. Because in the early days of white knuckling and trying to be abstinent, and we feel more crazy and our eating disorders are worse and we're binging harder and we're more discouraged and we hate ourselves more and we're gaining more weight. It seems like that path of abstinence is making everything worse instead of better. But truthfully, it's because of the approach, the mindset, the understanding that abstinence is a tool to freedom. It takes some nuancing and understanding around that. I don't know if you can maybe speak to that to help that mindset shift.
Yes, sure. I think a lot of it is around languaging. I think one of the things that I want to do, that I've been doing a lot in my own community and that I would like to do increasingly publicly, is to start changing the languaging around abstinence. I think, obviously I'm a literature professor. I think language is everything. Ha ha ha. No, not everything. But, the language around abstinence is just so negative. It just, I think it's really hard. And we live that inside of our bodies. I think it's really hard for many of us not to automatically believe that abstinence is the problem, because it is so maligned. And it is so associated with words and concepts like control and perfection, which are two other words that you've mentioned a couple of times. And one thing that was really important to me is to work that out in my journal. For me, I felt instant empowerment and instant relief through abstinence. That came very quickly. And so I didn't feel some of those self-doubt moments. I knew it was going to be hard, but again, I had quit smoking the year before. And so I had gone through, what's that phrase? You go through the wars or something like that. Anyway, I had gone through hell and back. Quitting smoking. It's still the hardest thing I've ever done. Do not recommend. Never smoke.
Really? It was harder than sugar and flour.
Oh my gosh. By tens of magnitudes, or whatever the mathematical phrase is.
Wow.
There will never be anything harder. Wow. And it's still the addiction that I occasionally fantasize about, and sort of make deals in my head about. Yeah, it's, and I'm not saying eliminating sugar and flour wasn't difficult, but I was prepped for what it was going to be like. And I also didn't have any negative associations, because I'm very value neutral about all of this. I don't believe that sugar is bad. I don't believe that flour is bad. I don't believe in that cultural messaging. I don't believe that food is bad. I also don't believe it's good. I believe it exists. And, I believe that there are substances in certain foods that basically when I eat them, for lack of a better term, I have an allergic reaction. I cannot moderate them. I cannot process them. My life becomes unmanageable when I eat those foods. That doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make them good. And so I have had the benefit of not having to sort of work through all of that negative messaging before I could even get to a place where I could tolerate abstinence. But so I think a lot of it is around languaging, around deliberately divorcing the equation of abstinence and, for example, control. I mean, nobody looks at somebody, I mean, pick any other chronic health condition. Nobody looks at somebody with asthma who's having an asthma attack and says, oh, you're going to use your inhaler? How controlling. You know, you should just intuitively let your body get through the asthma attack, you know? And so I think, you know, terms like control are just not relevant. I understand why people associate them, but we have to stop. It's not relevant. Or terms like perfection. I have not had a single molecule of sugar or flour for over 5 years, and that isn't perfect. It just isn't related to perfection. There's nothing perfect or imperfect about that. And that the kind of languaging that we attach to abstinence is so harmful for people who need abstinence recovery. I think another, oh shoot, there was something else that I wanted to bring up around that. Anyway, hopefully it'll come back.
May I prompt you?
Yes, please.
I'll attempt. I'll see if I can get you going again. So we were talking a bit about how to reframe abstinence, and you're talking about divorcing it from control and perfectionism. And is there other ways that we can reframe abstinence so that we can feel peaceful and grateful about it, as opposed to feeling like, oh, this is impossible and detrimental?
Yes, thank you. That was the perfect prompt. So one of the things that's been most empowering for me, which I came to on my own from my own background and the way that I see things. I was raised in, by a nurse. You know, I grew up in a medical household. I was raised by an ER nurse. My own research is into the history of medicine. I sort of perceive the world through the lens of bodies and health. And so to me, it's really more about reframing addiction as a chronic health condition, a chronic progressive health condition. And so reframing abstinence as just a health management tool. That's it. And I know I'm a little bit repetitive and I said it a couple times, but just kind of linking it to this part of the conversation here. I think for me, that has been incredibly empowering. It releases the value judgments around both addiction and abstinence. And it allows abstinence to simply exist for what it is, which, as you stated, is just a tool. It's a tool for managing a chronic health condition. That's it. I think that's going to be, I think if we're looking ahead in the future, 5, 10, 15 years, I think that's going to be one of the most powerful interventions in re-languaging and reimagining and reconceptualizing how we think about addiction itself. And then destigmatizing addiction. I think I think the stigmas around addiction are just as strong as the stigmas around abstinence. And that's been something that's been really important to me as well, as relanguaging and reconceptualizing addiction as totally destigmatized. I have no shame. There is nothing to be ashamed of about coming into this world in this lifetime as someone with a chronic health condition at all, or someone with the chronic health condition of addiction. It just happened. That's just the way it happened. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing bad about me. There's no deficit. I just have a particular chronic health condition. And if it isn't managed, it's very harmful to me and very harmful to the people around me, potentially, especially when I'm thinking about things like drugs and alcohol, and kind of what some of the fallout can be of that when my condition isn't managed. And so that reframing for me, I think has a lot of power and a lot of potential.
Yeah, I love that. And I think one of the other ways that we can start to reframe addiction as well is when we think about the fact that our brains can light up and get really jacked up and excited about substances. Those same brains can get jacked up and lit up and excited about other things. That we don't come into this world with brains that are flat, that can't experience pleasure in really intensely beautiful ways. But what we don't understand in the early days of recovery is that as we progressed along the path, our focus, our capacity to experience pleasure becomes more narrow and becomes very, very focused on just this pathetic little substance that over time doesn't even make us happy anymore. And then we just can't even imagine that anything would make us happy. But those beautiful addict brains of ours, man, take 2-3 years down the road and a sunset and the chirp of birds in the spring, and you're like, wow, right? Like life comes back online, and these beautiful addicted brains of ours can get hooked into healthy things. Like there's no way you got your PhD, Emily, probably without those same qualities that made you addicted applied to a work ethic around studying and writing, and right? Like you use that beautiful addict brain of yours, and you're using it right now. You're a professor. You don't need to be doing this interview. You don't have a book. You've got nothing to sell. You've got no skin in the game, except that you know you've walked this path and you have some life experience and some insights that your heart wants to share, and it probably brings you joy. And joy that's so much more than any joy we ever had when we were going off the deep end with Black Forest cake, which was my thing. But we could still have joy, but we don't understand that when we talk about addiction, that beautiful addict brain of yours just needs to find something like surfing or studies or something, and that it's possible for us to be happier and lit up in ways that rejuvenate and strengthen our lives and make them better and better, not worse and worse.
And what you're reminding me of, all of that, absolutely. And yes, I tell people at the beginning of this journey that the brain heals and the brain's capacity for joy increases, and you can feel it increasing. And that sustained abstinence gives your brain that chance to heal, and that the healing doesn't really stop. There's not like this ceiling that you hit where like, oh, good, my brain is healed, and this is the most amount of joy I will experience, or whatever. That like, I often use the phrase things like there are just vistas of discovery that await the perpetually healing brain. It's such a beautiful existence to kind of sit inside that brain, and that there is so much joy around, around the bend. I have, it's interesting because people come out of the woodwork when you kind of, when you're like the one person in someone's life who's on the abstinence journey, people start to kind of come to you. And so I've had just different people over the years kind of come to me, and especially around alcohol, because that, again, the sugar and flour for me wasn't actually the super difficult piece. I was never a foodie. I was just a hardcore addict. I ate disgusting junk food. And by disgusting, I don't mean morally wrong or morally bad, but just it tasted bad to me. It didn't even taste good. It was literally just a vehicle for a high. I didn't miss, there were very few things I ever missed food wise. But alcohol was a major struggle for me. Oh my gosh, it's difficult for me to describe how terrified I was to eliminate alcohol from my life as a part of my food addiction recovery. And so just, for folks who may not know, many abstinence-based food addiction programs also include the removal of alcohol, because alcohol kind of works the same way as refined sugar in the body. And so that for me was, it certainly was the thing that finally got me to be able to confront my alcoholism and my relationship to alcohol, and its increasing toxicity and actual danger to my health. And I was terrified to let it go. And I did all of the stages of grief with alcohol. I bargained the hell out of that. The first couple of weeks I was like, I'll start drinking again, like when I have a handle on this whole abstinence thing, with food or whatever. And then I'll just drink, on like holidays and like on vacation. And the whole time I was bargaining, I was remaining abstinent, but still, in the future, like, not today, but maybe tomorrow, which is another kind of well-known recovery phrase. And going through all the grief. Abstinence requires, I sometimes talk about abstinence as a kind of death. That's the other thing too, I think, that where people sort of get obstructed before they even get off the ground, because I think we're also afraid of abstinence and the finality of it, that we've made all these little hacks around like having to deal with the fact that it's forever, like it's just today, it's not forever. And that's fine. That's a good tool. But for me, that wasn't a useful permanent tool. I had to be able at some point in time to say never again, and to accept that eliminating addictive substances is a kind of death. You are leaving behind the person that you were, and you don't know the person who is coming. You literally don't know. And you don't know if it's going to be a lifetime of misery. You don't know if it's going to be a lifetime of sadness and depression and feeling left out and like, I can't have the glass of wine when my friends go out and my life is miserable. You don't know. And I was certainly convinced that, my whole life would just be not worth living. And that sounds very melodramatic, but that is exactly how I felt. I was not at all certain life would be worth living without alcohol. And I wasn't at all certain I'd be a person. I thought I would just not be a person at all. If that makes sense.
No, say more. What does that mean? You thought like you're like the essence of you would disappear, that you thought alcohol was so tied to who your personality.
And I think people feel that way about the foods. I think it's relatable because I think, if there's certain celebratory foods or certain family traditions or certain friend traditions, like there are certain foods and beverages that fall under sugar and flour that people feel like they will not be a person without them, that life is not livable, and that they don't have a personality. They don't have an emotional tie to humanity without being able to engage in those behaviors and those substances. Totally. And I can totally relate to that. Totally. It wasn't like that for me with the food, but absolutely with alcohol.
Yeah.
And so just providing the example that there is the other side, that there is that joy, and just wait that out. Just wait it out. I promise, that the healing comes if you let yourself, get there. And also accepting, doing that really difficult inner work, that really difficult grieving, that yes, this is a turning point. There isn't a hack here. You can't just, abstinence is, it can feel much more serious than other approaches, because it is a new way of life. It just is. And my advice and my experience was to not try to hack that, and to not try to pretend that wasn't the case, and to see it as an opportunity and a gift. The person I wasn't working for me, and my way of life wasn't working for me. And I had so many things inside me that I thought were possible that I'd never been able to access. And so I let that part of myself experience that death and that rebirth. And that was what was required. And that's okay. Like, that's actually so rad. I don't know why we're not giving that more cred. You know what I mean? I often say that addicts in recovery, how like it's everyone's desire to get a second chance at life. And like addicts in recovery get that. Like, I literally got to raise my life and then rebuild it from the ground up. Like, that's really cool.
Oh my gosh, it's such an amazing, exciting way of phrasing it. And, we say a lot in the recovery rooms that when we say no to sugar and flour, we're saying yes to so much more, right? When we're so focused on being deprived of whatever the sugar and flour concoction's been turned into, sure, we're saying we're depriving ourselves of that. But when we're eating it, what are we depriving ourselves of? We never look at that deprivation. We're always obsessed about being deprived of these treats, all these processed foods, but we're not looking at what we're depriving ourselves: self-confidence, health, great sleep, joy, the capacity to raise your, what did you say, raise your life to the bottom, like just start over, to rebirth yourself, right? To become somebody you didn't even know existed, to feel happier than you thought was even possible. Because high is different than happy, isn't it, Emily? High is different than happy. We can get high and spazzy and excited, and it feels like we're happy, and then it crashes. And then when we discover the happiness, it just comes from being connected to ourselves and living the lives that we love. It feels different, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And, I connect that with, a lot of the, neuroscience and brain chemistry research around dopamine. For me, and my understanding of addiction, centers around, I think of myself as someone who was born with a brain that doesn't produce and regulate dopamine in a neurotypical fashion. And so I have a very vexed and fraught relationship to joy and pleasure and happiness. In early childhood, it was very obvious that I had mood disorders, that my ability to regulate emotionally was not neurotypical, et cetera, et cetera. And so it has been interesting to me, because that is actually part of what I was afraid of, is giving up the highs, and even giving up the lows, for something I didn't know. And for something that people always used to call contentment, which I always used to grimace at. Like, who wants that? I want ecstasy.
Yeah.
I want to be high.
Give me bliss.
Yeah, exactly. And realizing that now that I have a brain that produces and regulates dopamine to its maximum potential, which still is not neurotypically, and that's okay, but to its maximum potential, finding just the absolute beauty in that. I also want to make sure to say, as somebody, who I really am passionately value neutral about the body and about health, that happiness isn't a requirement. That I believe, and I also don't believe that health is a requirement. I don't think, I don't think that anybody owes the world their health. I don't think that anybody owes the world their happiness. And I don't, for me personally, my goal in entering addiction, abstinence-based recovery was not health. I did have a lot of, health problems, or what are viewed by the medical field as health problems. And I, over the years, I had a different relationship to how I felt about that. But I never had a goal of becoming physically healthy. And I didn't even know I could become psychologically healthy. So I don't know if that was a goal of mine either. And so just to be able to capture the part of our potential community that doesn't want to be told to be healthy and doesn't want to be pressured to be healthy, there is a place for us too. And that you may find yourself becoming healthy as a kind of symptom of this, or you may not. And none of that is good or bad or right or wrong. And that too, I think, is a pretty... is a view that doesn't get brought up often in recovery circles and in abstinence circles. And, not all of us are healthy. In my food addiction recovery community, a lot of people talk about, some of the victories of recovery. And a lot of those victories are physical. And a lot of those victories are physical in a way that's like very mainstream. Like I can run up the stairs now. And like, that's what keeps me going in recovery. And like, there are plenty of people on earth who have bodies and limbs and bodily presentations that no matter what, they'll never run upstairs. And that is not a measure of health or not. And so that just for people in our community who feel alienated by like the talk of health and by the discourse of health, that there is also a place to practice abstinence-based recovery and not think about health at all. I mean, I very rarely think about health. I do have a different kind of health than I did when I was actively addicted. But I still I don't use health as my barometer. And that reminds me of something too, that I wanted to comment on from earlier, is that you talked about the things you talked about how, your addiction was killing you, and the many things that were killing you, about being actively engaged in your addiction. And I think another thing to contribute, another line item to contribute to that, is that for me, the way I think of it is that what was killing me is that I was chained to my addiction, is that I was chained to the substances. Whatever the side effects of that was, whether it was weight gain, arthritis, heartburn, there were plenty of side effects. But the real thing that was killing me was that my whole life revolved around basically one thing, which was, how do I get my next hit? How do I get this hit? And so I just wasn't participating in life. I just wasn't having a life. And that to me became unsupportable. And so I had to find a different way to re-enter life.
And I really, really get that, Emily. And I think it's clear. I might just add to it in case people are hearing that and thinking, what is she talking about, health neutral? How could you be health neutral? How could you be weight loss neutral? I have 150 pounds to lose. How could I not want that for myself? Through all this heroic effort of unhooking from these refined carbohydrates. And I just want to add to that, because honestly, as a coach, the people that struggle the most and relapse the most are the ones that are attached to outcomes. Even me wanting to sort of have my migraines go away and be less intense, or my depression go away, right? That I was relapsing constantly throughout all those focuses on the outcomes. It was only when I did exactly what you're describing. I did it because I have an addiction, and in my heart of hearts and in my soul, I know that when I in any way engage with those substances, I no longer have control on how much I'm going to eat, when I'm going to eat it. Like it takes over. The change, the feeling like I've lost my freedom here. And that was the only good reason for us to be abstinent, truly, is because we're on the addiction spectrum, and this addiction in and of itself. So if any other bonus things, like if we lose weight and our migraines disappear, they're bonus. But as long as we're focused on those outcomes, we're more likely to relapse. I've seen it as a coach over and over and over.
Absolutely. And partly because, they're not, if you really look at human behavior, those outcomes are not, they're not as seductive as people think they are. And they don't override the addiction. I mean, sometimes it helps people when we talk about food addiction. Sometimes it helps to think about other addictions, whether it's alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and think about how one's whole life becomes organized around procuring, ingesting, and experiencing the substance. And for example, something like weight loss isn't more interesting to me than the high. And it's certainly not over the long term. And I mean, that isn't a goal of mine at all, but for someone who is, I see time and time again, people whose goal is weight loss. And I see that ultimately being not more seductive and not more powerful than the addiction.
Absolutely. So beautifully put. Absolutely. It isn't a sustainable big why. They think it is, but it isn't. And it's only years of us being in these rooms, walking the path of recovery, that we've had to discover that the ones who get abstinent and stay abstinent peacefully and in perpetuity are ones that are only doing it for one reason. It's because it's their truth. Something is awakened, and they've realized that whenever I ingest sugar, flour, or processed refined carbohydrates, I do not go to bed peaceful, because it's violating something inside me that says that just ain't right. And it isn't enough to want to, of course, it's great outcomes that come from breaking up with sugar and flour. And I disagree with you. I love where you're at. I'm not there yet. I hope I get there one day. When I think of sugar and flour as neutral, I think of them as like deadly little, anyways, molecules. But I also appreciate that it's not helpful, that the neutrality is probably more supportive of recovery in the long term, to not be fighting, to just honor the truth. I know this is an addiction and I want my freedom. And that's the only reason that really, at the end of the day, I think really sustains peaceful abstinence, I think. Yeah. You agree?
Love it.
Oh, you love it. You're okay.
We may get there someday. We we may in 10, 20, 50, 100 years get to the place where we can maybe once again assign value to certain substances and say that those substances aren't great. But we're certainly not there right now as a culture. And I think it's absolutely detrimental to the overall health and wellness of the movement to linger in value-laden approaches to food. It's just, food has, value judgments about food have been used for so long to control so many people's bodies in such a negative way that we have to scrub value out of the equation altogether if we're ever going to get back to true equity, honestly, in embodiment.
Well, that is entirely what my summit is not about. I have to say.
That's okay. I'm an outlier.
Yeah, but fair enough. Like, it's food for thought, right? Because I have all these experts that come in and talk about, okay, when you eat sugar, this is what's happening in your brain and your blood and your pancreas and your liver and your cells and in your heart, right? Like, there's all these links. But mind you, I would probably argue that the white refined molecule of sugar is no longer a food. It really is just a drug. You take the poppy seed, you refine it, you get opium. It's a pretty powerful drug. There were lots of people hooked on opium and lost their lives, right? You refine it more, you get morphine. You refine that more, you get heroin. If you take sugar cane and beets and you refine it the same way you refine heroin, you get little white refined sugar. It isn't a food anymore, any more than heroin is a poppy seed, right? It's truly a drug chemical that, no kidding, it's addictive. Heroin's addictive, so is sugar, same. So maybe you and I could agree that sugar, the little white refined molecule, is no longer a food. Maybe.
Certainly. I believe that, yes. And yeah, processed sugar is not a food at all. But I absolutely, there's no argument about the observable effects of some of these substances on the body. It's that what keeps me in abstinence and what keeps me in recovery is just languaging that a little bit differently, and saying that the effect that those substances have on my organs and on my neurology prohibits my body from existing to its fullest capacity, and that's something that I don't particularly enjoy. That I would like to. And that's like the most value I'll put on it.
I got it. What you're saying, there's nothing wrong with sugar. I just don't really like how it feels in my body.
Yes.
Totally different. Very, yes.
And how it hijacks my life and prevents me from being engaged in life.
Emily, you are a gem. Let me tell you, I've had people tell me she is something that Dr. August, and you lived up to that highest of hopes I had for you. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your honesty and your insights and being the outlier, and for your time and beauty. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I loved it.
And we'll get a website for Emily when she gets it up and running, and we will all go out and buy her poetry book. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks for tuning in this week. If you would like more interviews, more information, and more inspiration on how to break up with sugar, go to my YouTube channel, Kick Sugar Coach, or my website, kicksugarcoach.com. See you next week.